Deb, it's so good to talk with you. You've been running around like crazy.
Yes, it has been a crazy week.
But you did fantastic in the primaries and defeated many people's expectations. And here you are in the race for Spokane County Prosecutor heading into the general election. How does that feel? Was it as much of a surprise to you as it was to many people?
To everybody else?
Well,
we had expected to be one of the top two. I know that there were a lot of people in Spokane who didn't think that that was possible, but I had really competent people looking at numbers for over a year, and they were pretty sure that I could get through the primary. And we looked at numbers for over a year, and we actually, the numbers suggest that it's actually a winnable race. And then when more Republicans started announcing, that sort of changed the question. But even then, when we looked at it, it seemed pretty clear that it would be one of the Republicans and me that went on to the general. The numbers just said that was likely. Election night was so amazing to be in first place on Monday night after that first vote count. And we're just all kind of going, holy cow, look what we did. So yeah, that was surprising and exciting. And there's a video we put up on the campaign Facebook page that night. And you can tell just from me in that video that I'm just kind of going, oh my word.
Right. No, it was fantastic. But then the numbers shifted a bit over time because the data show that, at least here in Spokane County, Democrats vote early and Republicans vote late. And so it shifted a bit over the course of the ballot counting. Is that right?
I've had any number of people tell me that the whole notion of who votes early and who votes late isn't really accurate about Spokane County.
Okay.
What happened was Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night, I stayed in first place. And then the next two counts, I ended up in second place. But there were no, like what my numbers guy said is, the trend kind of stayed the same. Yeah, Larry and I switched places, but we were only separated by 1,200 votes.
Wow.
So those two stayed at the top, and Stephanie Collins and Stephanie Olson, we kind of stayed mostly. My folks were looking at is a shift in trend, like would suddenly one of the two Stephanies start getting way higher, and that would be something to think about. What does that mean? And it just didn't happen. So pretty much the numbers in the end were close to what they were the first night. There was just that switch between Larry and I, which was, the difference there was always so small.
So every vote counts.
Oh, absolutely.
But how did we even get here? We haven't known each other for very long, Deb. Who was Deb Conklin? What's your backstory?
To be perfectly honest, I think one of the most important things about me is I grew up on a farm in rural New York State. And that really formed me in really important ways. You know, we learned the value of hard work. And I think integrity, I think nature teaches us integrity. You can't cheat Mother Nature. You just can't.
How do you mean that?
If you don't take care of the land doesn't take care of you. And my family had 6 kids and not a lot of money. There were often months where we were eating just what was in the canned fruit and vegetables in the freezer because the paycheck ran out before the month did. And so we depended on the land. And if you don't take care of it, it's not going to produce for you.
So you don't have instant plants. You have to feed the land, plant the seeds on time. And even if you do everything right, it still might not work out.
Right, and farmers around here know that well.
So how did you come from a farm in upstate New York to the Inland Empire?
There's a story. So I actually started college at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia because my parents would not let me apply to any schools that were too far away. So I went to Penn, where my brother had gone. And I actually was an architecture major and applied to the College of Architecture. And the year I would have started, my junior year, they did away with the undergraduate architecture major. So I was in the office when they were explaining to this new freshman that there was not an architecture major. And he was trying to say, well, can I put it together as an independent study? Can I do this? And they said no. And finally, this person, the staff person said, if you wanted an architecture major, you should have gone someplace else. And he's sort of like, your catalog said you had an architecture major, and I'm standing like 2 people behind him going, and I've spent 2 years working on my architecture major, and you've just eliminated it.
Right.
And so I just went to the dean's office and quit.
Okay.
And this was like 3 weeks into the term, and I just said, I'm done. And so then I worked doing drafting for a while, and I had always wanted to go west. So I worked for a couple years and saved up some money and looked at schools with architecture, undergraduate architecture degrees in the West. So University of Washington, University of Idaho, Montana State University, Colorado, one of the Colorado schools, and ended up deciding I wanted to go to Montana.
Okay.
And so I spent a year in Bozeman, and I met my first husband there. And we fell in love, and he was graduating, and so we went to University of Washington, where he started graduate school, and I finished up my bachelor's degree. And I just decided, you know, I'm in my 3rd school, and I've tried architecture, and it hasn't worked, so I got a philosophy degree and went to law school.
So you're in Seattle, and you've graduated with undergraduate degree in philosophy and a law degree, and what comes next?
So then my husband decided to take a job in the oil patch, and we moved to Colorado. So I graduated and headed to Colorado. He'd already started the job. He took the spring term off and started a job. So I finished law school and went to Colorado and passed the Colorado bar and clerked for a while in a law firm there. And then my husband decided to quit the oil patch and go back to school. So we moved back to the Pacific Northwest, and he was back at the University of Washington. And law jobs in Seattle were very hard to come by. And so I ended up interviewing with the prosecutor's office out in Clallam County in Port Angeles, out on the Olympic Peninsula, and got the job. And that was really a fascinating thing because my boss, David Bruno, was not known for being particularly inclusive of women. Like, he'd never hired a woman.
Were you the first woman hired in that office?
No, but I was the first one David hired.
Okay.
But I was the first woman David hired. And people were all kind of going, whoa, David's hired a woman. And what David said was he did not believe that women were discriminated against until that hiring process. And when he looked at the resumes that he was getting, the resumes of the women were consistently so much more impressive than the men that it just became clear to him that the law firms in Seattle were not hiring women that were as qualified as the men.
And how did that pan out in your day-to-day work as a deputy prosecutor?
Well, I had to prove myself. But that became really fun because one of the cases that had been filed that was coming up within like a week or two after I started the job was a domestic violence case. A man had pretty badly assaulted his wife. And this was one of the couples that had a history. They had charged him before, and she never wanted to testify. When I picked up the case, I'm going, how come these subpoenas haven't gone out? Because you subpoena the witnesses to make sure they're there. I always made sure the witnesses knew when the trial was and knew they were going to get a subpoena so they didn't feel like somebody's just ordering them around. But I said, we have to send the subpoena so that so that we're covered if anything goes wrong.
Right.
So I'm going, why aren't these subpoenas out? And I said, oh, because it can't go to trial because the wife's not going to testify. And I looked at the police report and I said, we don't need the wife to testify. Get the subpoenas out. And so the subpoenas went out. We get to court that day, and the defense attorney says, public defender says, why are the witnesses here? I said, because we have a trial. He goes, well, you can't go to trial. I said, I have the witnesses. I can go to trial. He says, you can't go to trial. The wife's not going to testify. I don't need the wife to testify. He said, you can't get a conviction without the wife testifying. I said, watch me. And the cops are going, Deb, what are you doing? I said, you guys put together a great case. We can do this. And they're going, are you sure? I said, we'll do this, guys. Really, we will.
And is this after, so Washington state law had changed in the late 80s, early 90s to permit a prosecution without the complaining?
This was before that.
Without the victim. Really?
This was like in 83.
Okay.
You have to have proof that the crime occurred without the confession of the defendant.
Right.
But you don't have to have a victim testifying.
Okay.
The cops had just done a really good job of documenting it and putting the case together. And we got a conviction. And cops are going back to the office going, we have a prosecutor. This is cool.
I bet. Because they're proud of their work. They want bad guys to get caught and prosecuted.
Yes.
Because otherwise it's just instant karma.
And it means a lot to them to have a deputy prosecutor who can take their work and get justice. I mean, the officers that I worked with, they wanted to do it right. So one of our office practices was, if you don't charge exactly what gets referred by the law enforcement officer, then you send a memo back and you say, here's what we're going to do and here's why. And sometimes the memo is, so you're charged it as a first-degree burglary, but there are these problems with the elements, and really what we have is a really strong second-degree burglary. So that's what we'll go with. Sometimes I'll send it back and say, I don't see what you've charged, but I also know that there could be other evidence out there that's not in the report. So if you can give me these elements, we can charge it.
And when you say elements, you mean the elements of the statutory crime?
Yes.
That have to be proved
Yes.
beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yes. Yeah, the facts. You have to have facts that prove each piece of the crime.
Of the law.
Yeah.
So beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard that a jury or a judge has to
Fact
find
finder, yes.
in order to find that somebody's guilty of a crime. And if it's not proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then they have to acquit the person charged with that crime.
Yes.
But that's very different than preponderance of the evidence. Can you, in lay people's terms, in the way that just somebody walking around in the world, what's the difference between reasonable doubt and preponderance of the evidence, and why does that matter as a prosecutor?
So there are actually three standards that are important.
Okay.
One is probable cause, and then preponderance of the evidence and reasonable doubt. Preponderance of the evidence doesn't really come up very often in criminal law. Preponderance of the evidence is how you reach the decision in civil cases, in cases where two people, somebody's suing the other person.
Is it more likely than not?
Yes.
That's
the preponderance of the evidence.
Okay.
Is it more likely than not? In a criminal case, in order to arrest, you have to have probable cause. You have to have reliable evidence that makes it probable that this person committed this crime.
Okay.
And that would be probable cause. And that's what you have to have for an arrest. And that becomes important because if you have a confession or a search or a seizure, those won't be allowed in evidence unless you had probable cause before you got those. So that's where probable cause comes up. When you file charges, and the vast majority of charges get filed and then the person gets either summoned in or a warrant issued. Not that many cases get filed because somebody's sitting in jail, waiting for the charges. So by the time you file charges as a prosecutor, the case is complete. The current office files based on whether there's probable cause. And it's not the practice that I learned. It's not what the statute says you should do. It's a waste of resources to file things based on probable cause in court, because if you don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the jury can't convict, and it would make no sense whatsoever to even try to go to trial. And so in many cases, what happens if you file based on probable cause, then you end up having to do a plea bargain because you can't try the case.
Well, and you have to do, in so many cases, a plea bargain anyway, because we just don't have a structure to take every case to trial that goes to trial, that comes before us. When I was a deputy prosecutor here in Spokane County, we had to clear 200 cases a month in district court just to stay level with the incoming caseload.
Right.
And you could only do 4 bench trials and 4 jury trials. So that meant 192 cases had to go away, something other than a trial.
So in our district court, we were able to do more trials than that. I mean, we sometimes had, in district court, we would sometimes get 2 trials in a day, even with jury trials.
Wow.
We had a pretty efficient court process. One of the ways of handling that is to make better use of our therapeutic courts, of the Veterans Court, the drug court, mental health court, because when you make use of those courts, you're not using the trial resources, and you're setting up a program to help people get their lives back together and make it less likely that they're going to end up back in court in a few weeks or months, depending on how long their sentence is. So therapeutic courts help with the caseload problem, but they also help with the revolving door issue. Because if you just start charging everybody with everything and, you know, locking them up for however much time you can get and then turning them loose again to the same situation, the same community, the same issues, they're just going to be back again. Whereas if they go through a program like therapeutic courts, then we help them change their lives, and the programs help them eliminate some of the pressures that result in the criminal behavior in the first place. So according to Tim Fitzgerald, who's the court clerk in a group I was having a conversation with, our Veterans Court has the best record in the country for reducing recidivism. And so we have really good programs that can take care of a lot of that caseload.
Well, and it also, the Veterans Court and other therapeutic courts, they help keep people's issues from snowballing.
Yes.
If they're in jail, they lose their jobs. They lose their jobs, meaning maybe they lose their home.
Yes.
And if they lose their job in their home, then it becomes almost impossible to get either of those things back again. And then people do become a greater, more expensive burden on the system.
Right.
If they can no longer pay their bills and keep a roof over their head, then that means the taxpayers, the rest of us.
And even if they're not committing crimes, they're still using resources that we have to somehow come up with. Yeah. So another issue is around pretrial release. So I was struck in February, I believe it was, when there was an article in the Spokesman, because a part of the MacArthur grant, which is a grant that Spokane has gotten for several years now from the MacArthur Foundation to increase justice, but in specifically to reduce the discrepancy around how people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds embrace the system or get treated by the system, and to reduce the jail population. Those were the 2 primary goals of the MacArthur grant. And in particular, there was a $400,000 grant for supported pretrial release that would have helped people start programs and would have been closely monitored before they even went to trial, rather than just sitting in jail. And so first of all, that addresses what you talked about. They're not sitting in jail losing their job and maybe their housing. And they're already starting to work a program that will help them deal with whatever the issues are that are leading them into the criminal behavior.
What sorts of programs would those be? Can you give a few examples?
More closely monitored drug or alcohol treatment, mental health treatment. So one of the problems with the mental health system, since we deinstitutionalized back under Ronald Reagan, is we have very few tools to use for mental health problems, because for many people with mental health issues, they'll get on whatever meds can help them, And then they do better, and they feel better, and they start functioning better. So they go, I'm cured, I don't need my meds. And they go off their meds, and then they decompensate, in some cases, pretty quickly. And what we have in most cases is we can at the most do a 72-hour hold for a mental health issue. And then they either have to agree to treatment or we have to let them go home. And 72-hour holds are sort of a bare minimum for helping somebody get stabilized. They don't address the underlying issues. So if we have someone who's committed a crime, or at least we have probable cause to believe they've committed a crime, if they're willing to go through the mental health court, then we can have like a 2-year program.
Oh.
That they can work that program, and we can have the consequence if they refuse to work that program would be then we can go ahead and file the charges. So that gives us more ability to keep people participating in the program long enough to see some real change.
Fantastic. So there's this MacArthur grant available to get people into drug treatment, mental health treatment, if they follow the rules and go through. It's an alternative to incarceration. But how's that been going?
What the article that I mentioned shows is this I mean, it painted a great picture. I love people who can tell a story well, and in this article they did. It paints this picture of the philosophic divide, and on the one side you have the prosecutor's office and the deputies saying this program is too expensive, it's not going to work, it's dangerous, there's too much risk, and opposing the program. And on the other side you have the judges and the defense attorneys and the community groups saying this would be a great program, it will be effective, it will get good results, it will save money, it will help people's lives. And the contrast was so stark. And when I first started talking about it in the campaign, about the second or third event that we were all 4 of us on a panel, Larry Haskell said, actually, we looked at that again, we changed our mind, and we've decided to embrace that.
Oh.
And the thing about it that made no sense to me is this is $400,000 that we can use for programs that are proven to work and that will let people stay out of jail, keep their jobs, keep their houses while they work on these programs, pre-trial. That also means that there's, depending on whose numbers you use, somewhere around $140, $150 a day that it costs to keep people in jail. So that money gets saved. For every person we have in that program, we have $150 a day that we can use as a county to ramp up some of the other things that we need to do to produce effective programs. So this is like leverage for helping us shift over to proven effective programs for dealing with non-dangerous offenders.
Fantastic. Well, it's good that there's a shift, but I've read some articles where Larry Haskell has said that he doesn't believe that there's racial disparity, or that he thinks it needs to be proved that there's a racial disparity in how people are treated in the criminal justice system in Spokane County. What have you seen? What sort of reports have you read, or the MacArthur Foundation? What were they basing their concerns about disparity on?
So there have been any number of entities that have looked into it. The most recent and a pretty compelling one is the Burns report that came out.
What's the Burns report?
3 or 4 years ago. It's the Burns Institute did a report that's looked very specifically at racial disparities in Spokane County, and it found that there were significant racial disparities in terms of stops, arrests, charges, and sentencing. What was surprising to me, but shouldn't have been, is the ethnic group that was most overrepresented in being charged and convicted were Indigenous people. And so in our county, at least, the people who are statistically most likely to be stopped, arrested, and charged would be the Indigenous population. They're heavily overrepresented in the criminal system compared to their presence in the culture.
And are there theories about why that is?
Well, sort of on the one side, the theory is that they just commit more crimes. And my response to that is, I don't think that's true. And if it were true, then the solution is to ask why and figure out what it is about how our community is treating our Indigenous population that would have that results. But I'm not sure that the reasons for it are really that much different than the fact that the Pacific Islander population and the Black population both have higher rates of engagement with the criminal system than white people. I don't understand how anyone can say there aren't racial disparities. Every study that's looked at it says there are.
Then that might suggest that the county prosecutor should be curious about why and look into it.
That would be a reasonable response.
And what have you seen instead?
Well, what you mentioned, the denial, we're not biased. It doesn't happen. One of the things that happened in the very first panel we did, some people call them debates. They're technically not debates. The League of Women Voters Forum, which is a better term. One of the questions was, how do you define or understand, or what do you understand inherent bias to mean? And what would you do about it if elected? And Larry Haskell's response was, we do all the programs. We all do all the racial bias programs, and my people have all been trained. Stephanie Olson's answer was, I've taken all the classes and I've done all the trainings. Stephanie Collins had an interesting answer because, and that's the order we answered, just happened to be the order for that question. Stephanie Collins' answer was, she said, I have a confession to make. And she talked about her interview with the Spokane Community Against Racism, SCAR, and how she discovered, particularly because a couple of them were willing to sit down with her afterwards and have a conversation, and she discovered that she really had essentially no understanding of what it was like to be a person of color in Spokane. So on the one hand, you have two people in the office saying, oh, we've done all the training, and you have a third person saying, I had not a clue. The interesting thing is, not one of them tried to explain what inherent bias is and what they would do other than we do all the trainings. And one of the concerns about that for me is, if we don't understand inherent bias, we're never going to address it. And I think when Larry Haskell says, my office doesn't engage in racial discrimination, I think we're still making that mistake between individual animosity towards a person of color and the inherent bias or the systemic bias in our system. And the systemic bias is one of the things that's causing huge problems. And one of the parts of that for me, which is really stark, is there was a study that I read a number of years ago now, in which they discovered that people who have been enculturated in this country consistently perceive a black male between something like, 10 or 12 and 30 as being bigger and more dangerous than they objectively are. So that explains, for example, the testimony of the officer in Ferguson who said he was huge and he was scary. And when you look at the numbers, the officer was just as large as the person he killed. And I avoid using names in these situations because I don't want to give people who engage in wrong behavior the recognition, and I don't want to further victimize the other people either. So I tend to avoid names most of the time. Everybody was sort of surprised when it turns out that this white officer perceived a black victim to be larger than he was and dangerous when objectively he wasn't. But it turns out that that's a culturally induced reaction that we have. And so, for example, if you've ever watched the video of, and I'm going to name names here just because I don't know how else to identify it, Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old in a park in Ohio playing with a toy gun. And someone made a call in, and what the video shows is a car coming up, officers jumping out, and within 2 seconds they had killed the 12-year-old. 2 seconds. Because they perceived him to be larger, older, and more dangerous than he objectively was. One of the reasons we have got to both understand and address inherent bias is because until we do, we are going to consistently have people perceived as dangerous who aren't. And when you're dealing particularly with a law enforcement situation, and so you have a law enforcement officer responding to a call where somebody says there's this person who has a gun and they're dangerous, and they throw in, it's black and he is black and male and dangerous. The police officers are doing their fight or flight reaction place rather than their rational responding place. And they react out of that cultural conditioning rather than a more rational response.
As did the person who called it in.
Absolutely.
It goes all the way back to that.
The whole process. And so inherent bias is something that we have got to address, or we will never fix disparate treatment. And it was stunning to me that on this panel, the other three people didn't even know how to talk about it.
And one person did, but it was late. It wasn't because of anything she'd gotten through her training.
Well, and so, maybe she doesn't, because she didn't talk about it. She just said, I'm open to learning. So,
notwithstanding the bias, given our demographics in Spokane County, the vast majority of criminal defendants are poor white people.
Yes.
And so this isn't something, the therapeutic courts addressing the root causes of criminal behavior isn't some sort of extra gift that would be given to minority populations in Spokane. It's something that everybody in the system would benefit from.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things we don't talk about is the ways in which socioeconomic standing affects who ends up in the criminal system.
Because we're supposedly a classless society.
That's a myth.
Yes.
And it's something we don't like to talk about.
And so how are poor people treated differently, or working class people treated differently, say, than upper middle class or wealthy people?
So here's an example. This isn't Spokane County. This is actually when I was a prosecutor in Clallam County, but it would be the same today. I had a case where 4 20-something very well-off young men were a group. They hung around a lot together. This was not a drug gang or anything like that. It was just well-off young men. And I don't even remember now what it was, but they got angry at this one guy so one of the things about Clallam County is there's a fair amount of poverty. And in particular, there are people who live up some of the rivers near the national park, Olympic National Park. And they go into the park and they find downed trees and they cut them up for firewood and they sell firewood. And that's how they live, is selling firewood. And so there was one enclave with a house and a couple travel trailers up one of the rivers. And this guy that these 4 men were upset with lived in one of the travel trailers in this small residential place. And so one night they went up there, and there's more to the story, but one of the things they did is they started shooting up the house in which there was a mother with a 2-month-old baby and 3 other young children.
Oh my.
And she ended up taking all of the kids and hiding under a piece of furniture in the most center room she could get in the house while they're shooting up the house looking for this guy. And so I charged them. And when we got ready to go to trial, we had to bring the witnesses, the victims, in, and we made the decision to use the sheriff's facilities to give them all showers and put clothes from one of the thrift centers on them so that when they came into court, they would be credible as witnesses. Mm-hmm. And I had any number of people tell me I was wasting the county's resources charging that case because the victims were just white trash.
Ouch.
And we got convictions on the 4 guys.
So important. Because equal justice under the law is the standard that we should all be aiming for.
But when people are poor, and poor white is, one of the socioeconomic categories, I think the predominant view is if they tried harder, if they had worked harder in school, if they made better choices, they wouldn't be poor. They bring it on themselves.
It's all individual accountability.
They're the ones that chose to live in that shack up in the woods and raise their children there. And that's the risk you take.
I found when I was a deputy prosecutor that I had to unteach lessons that jurors had learned by watching television and movies, where defendants are always accompanied by evil music, so you can tell that they're the bad guys. And victims are clean and quiet and sad, and clearly the victims, the innocent victims
Right.
of crimes.
Right.
And the world in real life isn't that cut and dried. We sometimes have attractive defendants and unattractive survivors of crime. That's another step that we have to take as prosecutors, and it's the sort of thing that you sort of set up in advance so that you could get the convictions.
Yeah. The hardest cases are child sexual assault cases because, first of all, and I'm talking now about the ones that are pedophiles but don't use weapons against the victim. Mm-hmm. They use manipulation. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's very difficult is most pedophiles can be charming because that's how they groom their victims and that's how they end up being able to victimize them. And so when they come to court, they're putting on their charm and their defense attorney has prepared them. And it is very difficult to get a jury to look at this nice person, usually male, mm-hmm. this nice guy who looks like their next door neighbor. And we don't want to believe that they can molest our children mm-hmm. because then we have to worry about our next door neighbor. Yeah. And if it's somebody who's married and has kids or whatever, it's sort of like people like that don't molest children, except they do.
Right.
And so it is incredibly difficult to get a conviction in a child abuse case because people look at the defendant and go, I can't wrap my head around this person being that evil monster mm-hmm. that my mind sees when I think of child molesters.
Somebody who sits next to me in church. Somebody who works at a school. Somebody who volunteers with the Boys and Girls Club.
And in particular, those places where children are most available and vulnerable, because those are where pedophiles go to find victims.
Mm-hmm. In juvenile court, I found that we're, of course, the survivors of child sexual abuse as well as the abusers are children. We often found it was only as a result of prosecuting the juvenile offender that we discovered that there was an adult behind that who had abused the child.
Right, most juvenile offenders have been abused themselves.
Right. But it wasn't discovered until the prosecution because it was a trusted uncle, it was a babysitter, it was somebody else.
Right.
And the families had no idea that their child had gone through that.
Right.
Because it's so well hidden. So you've been a prosecutor your entire life?
No.
No. So how did you go from, but you stopped being a deputy prosecutor. What created that change?
So at some point, I'd had a child, and while he was an infant, I could still mostly work the 60 to 80 hours a week that had become the norm. But as he got to be a 2-year-old toddler, because I actually had a bassinet in my office, like literally when I went back to work after he was born, I would go home from work and nurse him and have some dinner, and then I would come back and put him in the bassinet and I would keep working. And I had an awesome, one of the state troopers' wives took care of him and, was willing to deal with my quirks about not using disposable diapers or baby formula or anything like that. But, when he became a toddler, that wasn't working. So there was a lot of stress around that and trying to figure out how I could keep doing my job and have a toddler. And there were also some issues in Clallam County. At that point, we had a judge that ended up getting censured because he actually sat on the bench one day and said, I'm not sure what to do in this case because I don't know this person, and so I don't know how to deal with it, because he never could get it through to him that he's only supposed to make decisions based on what's presented to him in court.
Right.
He relied on everything he knows, and in particular, I had to learn how to joke him out of inappropriate questions, because in a bigger county, you would never have a conversation in chambers with a judge that you had a case in front of pending. But when you only have 2 judges, and you have to have search warrants, and you have to have subpoenas, and you have to get things signed, that's not an option. You have to go in and get the judge's signature. And so you'd walk into chambers and he'd say, so how's such and such a case going? Or tell me about this. And I would have to find ways to just sort of jokingly avoid the question. And other attorneys didn't always do that. And so I finally had a case where it just became clear that the defense attorney had been telling the judge things that were not true.
He'd been working the ref.
And I just said, I don't know how I can get a fair trial for my clients. And keeping in mind that my client at that point was the people of the county when I have that kind of a judge. So there was a lot of stress going on, between my family and my work and all that. And so I finally decided to take a break from law. And then after having 2 kids and going through a divorce and some other things, I ended up going to seminary instead of going back into law.
No kidding.
You know what they say about ministry, particularly when you're in seminary, the conversation is no one chooses to go into ministry. God decides, and you either say yes or no. And in my case, it was like I kept saying no, and God kept saying, yeah, I think so.
It was an insistent calling.
Yeah. So I ended up in seminary, ended up going into ministry as a United Methodist minister. Now, there's a situation in which I did think about. So in law, I was sort of the second wave of women in law, and that was okay. We still had issues, like, when I got hired and my boss finally admitted there was discrimination against women, and having to convince the officers that I was actually going to be a gung-ho prosecutor and not just be a wishy-washy woman. But when I finally said, okay, it looks like I'm going to have to answer this call to ministry, they had just started ordaining women in the Episcopal Church. And I had been going to an Episcopal church in Port Angeles. And I thought, I could be in the first wave of women priests in the Episcopal Church. And I no more had that idea than I thought, but if I'm going into ministry, I'm going to have to be Methodist. My soul is John Wesley's version of what it means to be a Christian. And in the Methodist Church, we've been ordaining women for decades. Yes.
And what does that mean? What does the method of being a Christian, what is that?
So one of the things about John Wesley is, first of all, he was often accused of not being a real theologian, because he was very much a practical theologian. John Calvin and Luther wrote all these treatises, and most of what we have from Wesley is actually sermons that he preached. He didn't write a lot of treatises. And he tended to try something, and if it didn't work, he'd try something else. So one of the things I teach when I teach history is Jesus actually came to reform a institutionalized, rigid Judaism of his day, and he tried to bring reform to that. He never left the Jewish tradition. He died a Jew. But his followers started this Christian tradition. Martin Luther did not leave the Catholic Church. He tried to reform a rigid, institutionalized Catholicism and failed and got excommunicated, but he still considered himself a Catholic. John Wesley tried to reform a rigid, institutionalized Church of England. I mean, it was so institutionalized that you had to worship in an approved place. Like John Wesley went out and preached to people coming out of the mines and the sweatshops and the places where they worked because they couldn't get to church on Sunday morning. And what he did was technically illegal. In England.
Wow.
Yeah. He did not ever leave the Church of England. He died a priest in the Church of England. But he started a movement, which ended up being called Methodist because he was so methodical. And he would get small groups together in discipling groups, is the term people would use today. We use covenant discipleship group is one of the names, but in small accountability groups where they would be held accountable for acts of justice, acts of mercy, acts of personal worship, and acts of public worship each week. And those groups helped change people's lives. So, for example, men who had been getting their paycheck and stopping at the bar on the way home and drinking most of it went home and used that money to support their families. And so Methodists started becoming more kind of middle class. I actually read in a secular history book, like a high school history book, that the Methodist movement in England was critical to undoing many of the abuses of the Industrial Revolution. So starting schools, starting orphanages, changing the life of families. The Methodist movement has always been a force for justice.
And so it sounds like if that's your understanding of the Methodist Church, then transitioning from being a deputy prosecutor to a minister in that church isn't a break. It's a continuation on a related path.
One of the people I worked with in Port Angeles, I saw several years later, and she said to me, deputy prosecutor to pastor, how do you go from accountability to forgiveness? And I said, because forgiveness involves confession and repentance. And that is accountability. the Spokane Faith and Values, one of their reporters did an interview with me that was more personal. Like, we didn't even talk about, most of the issues. And she interviewed my sister Sheila as well to try to get sort of a what was she like growing up type of thing. And Sheila said, and I was touched by this, she said, Deb has always been about justice. Whatever she's doing, that's been one of her fundamental values. And I was remembering, I got to give the 6th grade graduation speech because I did a K through 6, grade school, and I got to give the speech at graduation. And I included in my speech quotes from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. This is in rural New York State in 1965-ish. I mean, it was within a year or two after King actually gave the speech. There was this whole kerfuffle about whether they were going to let me give the speech, because keeping in mind, Martin Luther King was still alive and a controversial figure at that point. And so there was this whole, issue about, they brought my parents in, they talked to me, and in the end, the final decision was that I was allowed to give the speech as long as I read it word for word and didn't change anything. But in 6th grade, I'm quoting Martin Luther King, who is still alive and causing issues.
Occasionally getting jailed.
Yes. So justice has always been a fundamental value in my life and my work.
Okay. So you get through seminary, and what comes next?
My first church was Roselia, which is about half hour, 40 minutes south of Spokane. And they had pictured me as this city girl because I had lived in Seattle for 20 years, for a lot of time. And so they thought I was a Seattle person coming to this small rural town. And I was the second female pastor they'd had. The one before me was married. And so they had some issues around a female pastor, but at least she had a husband who would do things like mow the lawn and change the light bulbs and things like that. And they were totally panicked. They were totally panicked that they were going to have a single mother, and I was going to call them every time a light bulb burned out, or every time a circuit blew. And they were totally in a panic about it. Shortly after I got there, they found me changing the spark plugs in my car. And they're going, whoa, maybe she does know how to do a few things. And then one night, I was doing the youth group with one of the 20-something farmers. Because of our safe sanctuaries issues and things like that, you have to have a male and a female, like when you're doing the youth group. You have to have 2 leaders, ideally male and female. And so Bruce and I were doing the youth group together. And as they were all going home, one of them went out the back door and came back in, and it had a rod about this long with some threads on one end and a disc here. And he's holding it up and goes, I just found this in the alley. Picked it up because it was where cars would drive through. And I looked at it and I said, how do you lose a strut top and not know it? And Bruce just looked at me and said, how do you know what that is? And I said, it's a strut top. And so at that point I was in. I was
Sure.
like, okay, she knows what to do. We're not going to have to, wait on her hand and foot.
Right.
And by then they had discovered that I actually grew up on a farm and did know some things. But it's a getting to know you situation. They have a certain preconceived notion of what I'm like, and I have to get to know them.
Yep. And next, we're trying to get you to Spokane.
Yes. So the bishop moves you around, and so I served a church out in Ocean Shores and out in Denver. So for the last 25 years, all but a couple years in Ocean Shores, I've lived around Spokane. And then in 2007, the bishop actually appointed me to Liberty Park as one of my 2 churches. And that's in the South Perry district. And so I've been in Spokane since then.
And what drew you back to prosecution again?
So 8 years ago, when Steve Tucker resigned,
In 2014. 2014, Steve Tucker resigns.
And Larry Haskell was a deputy in the office who ran, and Brian Beggs ran against him. And Brian lost, and Larry became the prosecutor. And then 4 years later, when Larry ran in 2018, he ran unopposed. And I talked to several attorneys and said, so who's going to run against him? Why aren't you running? And, people had their reasons, but it became pretty clear that it was going to be hard to find somebody to run against Larry. And at that point I said, well, I can run against Larry. I just have to, jump through the hoops to get my license again. We need someone who's going to raise these issues that we need to have raised in Spokane County. The racial disparity, the overcharging, the charging standards. Brian had ran on a Smart Justice campaign, which is about doing things that are proven effective, that get better results, that reduce repeat offenders, and that actually save money. Mm-hmm. And so he wanted to bring those sorts of approaches to the prosecutor function in Spokane County. And in the campaign, Larry said, well, I support Smart Justice. If it's going to save money, we should do it. And then after he won in November, when the Smart Justice team asked to sit down and have a meeting with him, he says, I don't support Smart Justice. If you wanted Smart Justice, you should have elected Brian.
Oh.
And that was the end of Smart Justice. And so I just decided that having him run unopposed again was not an option. And so I went through the whole, and of course, having not practiced for that long, I had to start over, and I had to, go through the background check and bar exams and all of that. The one thing that I lucked out on, which is one of the few silver linings in the whole COVID pandemic, is I did not have to take the multi-state exam. I had to take the Washington exam and the ethics exam and some other things, but the multi-state I was scheduled to take in 2020. And the state of Washington could not put together a space that was COVID safe and secure for the bar and administer it. So it said anyone who has a law school degree from an approved law school can automatically be admitted this year. And by the way, you won't ever get reciprocity from another state because you won't have passed a bar exam, but you can practice in Washington. So some of us took that option. Some sat for the bar, and that freed up enough spaces so they could do spacing and administer the bar to those that chose to take it. But I didn't need to pass a bar. I've already passed 2 bar exams. Mm-hmm. If I get admitted, I have passed bar exams. And so I took that option. So there was a little piece that I didn't have to, I did the review class, I studied, I just ended up not having to sit for it. But I spent 4 years and got my license back so that I could run, because I thought it was important that we offer voters an alternative to what we have.
So if you're actually in favor of less government, it sounds like Smart Justice should be the option that you'd want to go.
I've never understood why anyone doesn't adopt the Smart Justice approach. Those who are engaged in Smart Justice and promoting it, there are practices and approaches that have been proven effective, that we know work, and that save money in the process. And why would you not adopt them? It doesn't make sense to me. The other thing that I think is really important this year in the election is in May, the president issued an executive order that said the Justice Department and the FBI and all of the national law enforcement entities are directed to look into all of the ways that we can reduce racial disparity and reduce recidivism and have a more effective criminal system. And it was like there are timelines and there are criteria and there are, required reporting of results from all of those entities. And they are required to share everything they produce, what they find to be effective and time-tested. They're required to share those with state and local and tribal agencies. So over the next 2 to 4 years, there are going to be a lot of resources coming out of the federal government about how we can do things better, how we can be more effective. And we need someone in our prosecutor's office who's going to embrace those and take advantage of that gift rather than say, we don't need to change anything. We're doing fine the way we are.
Right. So that gift is a taxpayer-funded asset that would be available to us at no additional cost if we only pick it up and use it.
That's right. That's
that
right.
seems like a very fiscally responsible approach to criminal justice.
Yeah, why not take advantage of something that's being handed to you?
So when you're elected, Deb, do you see yourself spending a lot of time in the courtroom?
I love doing trial work. I did.
It's fun.
You know, one of the things, so when I first started doing this, somebody said, but you haven't been in court in so long. And I said, so here's what I know. Having been a prosecutor, deputy prosecutor, and a pastor, there are 2 skills that are really important to each. One is the ability to sit down with a person in crisis and help them tease out their story in a way that doesn't continue the trauma. You know, help them start to heal from the trauma, but nonetheless be still able to share their story and offer nurturing. And prosecutors have to do that all the time.
Absolutely.
And pastors do that all the time.
Yeah.
It's called pastoral care. The other skill is being able to stand up in front of a jury, a group of people, and tell the story in your opening statement, in your closing argument, in the way you ask questions. Tell the story in a way that helps the audience get the picture, see the story, understand what happened, and then invite them to do the right thing. That's what you have to be good at to be a good trial attorney. I do that every Sunday. I tell the story, I help people see the story, and I invite them to do the right thing. So those are skills that I have continued to practice all this time. Obviously, before I go into a courtroom, I'm going to have to get better at the rules of evidence. One thing people don't tend to understand, and even attorneys who do civil work don't always understand, that being a prosecutor is probably the hardest legal job there is. Because when you're a civil attorney, you have all this discovery. You have, depositions where everybody gets to ask all the questions and get the answers. You have interrogatories where you send them written questions and get all the answers. And so, in the legal profession, everybody says, if you're doing a civil case and there's any question that gets asked in a courtroom to which you don't already know what the answer is going to be, you didn't do your preparation.
That's practically malpractice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when you're the prosecutor, you don't get that. You don't get to do interrogatories and depositions.
Because
you depose professional, if there's an expert witness, you might get those, but often you just get your own interview. Right. And although the defense attorney gets all of your witness statements, you don't get all of their witness statements.
Right.
And so of all the roles, you're the one who has to be prepared for surprises in the courtroom. You have to know the rules of evidence. You have to know the rules of criminal procedure. You have to know all of it. And you have to be able to pull it off the top of your head in an instant, because the trial keeps on going, or things get said. And if you don't object quick enough, more things get said. And so being a prosecuting attorney is, I think, the hardest job in the legal system, because you have to be able to react and to know what you're doing. You can't go back to your table and look up which rule of evidence you want to cite. You have to be able to, tell the jury or tell the judge what rule it is and what you're relying on. Right. Make your argument just spontaneously. So will I go into the courtroom? I don't know. I think one of the things that people don't realize when they're voting for this office is the prosecuting attorney, the elected prosecutor, doesn't have to try cases. There are prosecutors in this state still, like in office right now, who've never tried a criminal case because they focus on the civil side of the office and they hire a chief criminal deputy. They don't do criminal trial work, and they don't have to. it's important to keep in mind that the elected prosecutor is the administrator, the person who runs the office. You have to be good at hiring people. You have to be good at making sure people get trained, whether you do it yourself or have someone in the office that you've identified as good at it. You have to make sure it happens. You have to make sure the office is run smoothly. You set the policies. So for instance, when we talk about charging standards, probable cause versus beyond a reasonable doubt, that's a standard that you set because that's a policy and you're in charge of policy. So that part, and there's the whole civil side, which one thing that's fascinating to me is when we look at the elections for prosecutor, very seldom do people talk about the civil side. But we have just moved from 3 to 5 commissioners, and we're going to have to be sorting out how that looks and what processes might have to be changed at the county commissioner level to make sure that goes smoothly. And so we need deputy prosecutors who can help the commissioners do that and do it well. We have a history in Spokane County of approving developments that are outside the urban growth boundary in spite of, and I was at one of these hearings where the representative from the state and the people from the Spokane city government said this is against the law and it causes problems for the city when you create these developments that are outside the urban growth boundary, and then the city has to extend sewer and water and services, and the city is trying to create more density so that it can have affordable infrastructure, and the county keeps expanding it. And the county's been sued at least twice and lost when they violated the law and created these developments. But what happens is when they pass the approval of the zoning, the developers have all their paper ready. They go in the next morning and file and get their permits. And so by the time the county loses the lawsuit, the permits have already been granted and they get grandfathered
Construction's
in.
done.
And so the development happens. And so we need a prosecutor's office that's going to say to the commissioners, you can't do it. It's illegal.
So the elected prosecutor in Spokane County has one of the largest, if not the largest law office in the county that's responsible for both criminal as well as civil work.
Right.
And so, in essence, you're becoming the managing partner of
a good-sized law
large firm with a lot of very experienced people,
Yes.
attorneys who've been working criminal as well as civil
Yes.
work for years and even for decades.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to rely on those folks.
Yes.
But you steer the ship.
Yes. Yes. So at Pig Out, I was talking to one of the current deputies, and they said, so what are you going to do if you get elected? I said, so what part are you asking about?
Sense, right.
And she said, well, about the office. And I said, for example, and she said, well, are you going to just get rid of all the attorneys that are there and hire new attorneys? And I said, no.
That would be terrifying.
No, that would be crazy. I said, my plan is, after the election, I would contact every deputy in the office and invite them to meet with me, one-to-one, and have a conversation and talk about, what are you doing? What have you done? What's your passion? What would you love to be doing in the office? If you could have any, position in the office, what would it be? What's your 5-year plan? How can we help you meet your 5-10-year goals in your career? If somebody's goal is to get a lot of trial experience so they can go out and get a really prestigious job in a firm, we can help them do that. I would not feel like that was a wrong career goal. I think the prosecutor's office is a great place to get trial experience and get good at it and then go market your skills. I think that's a legitimate career path. If somebody wants to be a career prosecutor and get involved in domestic violence cases, then let's help them follow their passion. And so I would sit down with each person and get a sense of who they are, where their passions lie, what they want to be in the office, and then make sure that as we made changes in the office, which are inevitable. And I don't mean changes like get rid of that person and hire that person. I mean, positions in the office shift. You know, you move things around, you see what works. And so the more we can put people in places where they're passionate about the work they're doing, the more effective they're going to be and the better the office is going to run.
And it serves us all to keep that experience at work for the people of Spokane County.
Well, and maybe somebody who sits down this fall and says, so my goal is to get some trial experience and go market myself to a firm, they may discover there's something that they really enjoy and love, and they may end up being a career deputy.
So is there anything I have failed to ask you that you would like me to tee up for you, or anything else that you'd like the voters of Spokane County to know about Deb Conklin?
I think the fiscal part is something that voters probably have a concern about, and that I think it's important to talk about. So I believe that if we change from charging based on probable cause to charging based on we already have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that will save resources, both time and money, not just in the prosecutor's office, but in the court system.
The whole system, all the way through to incarceration. And
one of the questions that comes up, and it's come up in some questions to me, but it comes up in the county often, is what about a new jail? Because we do have some folks who have been trying to get a new jail for a long time. And the way I look at that is, it is possible that we need a new jail, because that jail is old, there are issues, and I've heard horror stories about some of the problems with the building. But we should not even be talking about a new jail until we know how to right size the jail. What size jail do we need?
we don't necessarily need more jail.
Right. So until we have implemented these proven ways to reduce the jail population, and to see how that sorts out, and to look at what it looks like to have a different system, someone in the office who embraces electronic home monitoring, supervised pretrial release, therapeutic courts, until we've practiced that and seen what the numbers are, we have no idea what size jail we need. So I think one of the things that I think is really important is I would bring fiscal responsibility to the office in a way that I don't think we have at the moment.
So safety for the community, but also not wasting taxpayers' money, as well as providing justice.
Well, and really, I mean, that's the essence of smart justice, is you only use things that have proven to keep people safe as well as save money. And I mean, the revolving door is a big part of it. I was talking to actually, it was a reporter, and she was talking about the drive-by shootings that we've been having, which is a huge problem. Drive-by shootings, they're one of the hardest things to deal with when you're dealing with law enforcement and the legal system. Drive-by shootings they feel random to the population. I mean, the actors feel like they're not random because they're, going after somebody who done them wrong. But the reality is, for the community, they just feel totally random, totally dangerous. People die. But the point that this person brought up is, when they find and arrest the people, usually young males, who've committed a drive-by shooting, they often find that they have this long history of criminal behavior and arrests. And I said, and what if the first, second, third time they were arrested, we tried to find out what we could do that would help them not pursue a life of crime? What if this is about getting involved in a gang because they want to have a cell phone for themselves and their family can't afford it, or a letter jacket because they're involved in high school sports and their family can't buy them a letter jacket? What if there are things we can solve, and we solve those problems the first time or the second or third time they're arrested? Then we don't have a drive-by shooting. reducing the crime rate has to do with identifying what's causing the crime and addressing it. You know, it's sort of like the whole thing about the dead bodies coming down the river. Instead of just pulling out of the water, let's go upstream and figure out what's causing the dead bodies.
Right. Deb Conklin, thank you so much. Somebody who's been pursuing justice your entire life. I hope that we'll have a chance to have you do that on behalf of everybody in Spokane County.
Thank you.
Thank you.